Welcome to the Feisworld podcast, engaging conversations that cross the boundaries between business, art, and the digital world.
John Haggerty has been a dear friend of mine since 2003. I welcomed him to the Feisworld podcast to share his experiences as an on and off Broadway actor for over 25 years. John has appeared in productions such as Les Mis on Broadway and the national tour, The King and I, Miss Saigon, Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots, I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change, Gotham, Batboy, and The Living Room. Even though I've known John for over a decade, we never had a chance to have an open career discussion such as this one. To my surprise, I'm rediscovering John and hearing stories for the first time. In this episode, John reveals the randomness, rejection, and excitement of living and working as an actor. The day before our interview, John found out he had been cast for a new show. How do you memorize dialogue for Broadway shows that go on for hours? I was surprised to learn that John finds it much easier to memorize Shakespeare plays than modern dialogue. In this episode, he will explain to you why that is. My personal favorite is when John shares his method for memorization. He uses a yellow pad to 1. Write out everyone's lines, 2. Highlight his own lines, 3. Record in his own voice and listen to his iPod while running. All just to trick the words into his fingers, his brain, and further connect neural pathways. I asked John how he faces the pressure of performance, a pressure we all feel in our working lives. John asked us to recognize and remind ourselves that everyone is trying their best. This is your moment. Do the best with what you got and embrace it.
Excerpt from a song called A Puzzlement from King and I, originally done by the immortal Yul Brynner. And just before he sings the song, his son, the Crown Prince, has asked him some questions about life and how things work, and he doesn't really give his son a satisfactory answer. His son walks off stage, and the king is left alone to contemplate his life, and you realize that he's just another guy like all of us, just trying to figure it out. So here's a little excerpt of from Puzzlement. Shall I join with other nations in alliance? If allies are weak, am I not best alone? If allies are strong with power to protect me, might they not protect me out of all I own? Is it danger to be trusting one another? One will seldom want to do what other wishes. But unless someday somebody trusts somebody, there'll be nothing left on earth excepting fishes. There are times I almost think nobody's sure of what he absolutely knows. Everybody find confusion in conclusion he concluded long ago. And it puzzled me to learn that though a man may be in doubt of what he knows, very quickly he will fight. He'll fight to prove that what he does not know is so.
One of the things, John, I think you are really unique. You have a very unique story to tell, and perhaps you don't feel that special living in the middle of Manhattan, New York City. You know, you feel like a lot of people around you perhaps are a lot like you. But over here, even in Boston, not so far away, and as you can imagine, other parts of the United States or even all around the world, it's really difficult for someone to imagine, even for me to imagine, what it's like to be an actor of any kind, you know, Broadway, TV, movie, and I really kind of want to live in your brain. I want the audience to live in your brain for about an hour to understand where you're coming from, and we'll go through a few questions, but I want them to first actually hear from you who you are, just a little bit about you. So without seeing your face, which they will in the blog, you know, hearing your voice, they could get a sense for who you are.
All right. Well,
So this would be like if I ever did any of that Match.com stuff, this would be like my first time over a cup of coffee, right?
That's right.
I've lived in New York on and off since 1989, and boy, it's been a different world since then. Every time I meet people who lived back then and up till now, we'll talk about the vast changes in New York. We talk about a New York minute, and when it spans 25 some odd years, it definitely seems like a different place. I actually have a friend crashing with me, yet again, another New York thing to do when you have a Upper West Side apartment, have friends, and I'm very glad to do this because people have helped me so much over the years. People need a place to stay, the couch is welcome, it folds out. And it's funny, he's actually one of my best friends from my college days, who used to be an actor himself, and had a great career, and he probably doesn't, well, I've told him this, he was kind of like my idol in college. He was the star actor in school and went on to a fantastic drama school and had a great career working in the theater, and then he decided, I guess it was age 40, then he said, I'm done. And now he's a writer.
Wow.
And now he says to me, if you're ever going to go out of the arts, John, the last thing you don't want to do is go from actor to writer. It's not going to be any easier. If you're going to leave one arts field, you might as well leave it and don't make my mistake, he says. Anyway, so I've, as I was saying, I've lived here for most of my adult life. And prior to that, I guess I traveled a lot as a kid. Since my dad worked for the government, we got shuttled around like a military family. So we went from base to base to base. I had 3 or 4 different elementary schools.
Wow.
I think 3 high schools I remember. And in some ways, I continued that peripatetic, oh my God, listen to me. Peripatetic, why am I saying that? That's such an SAT word to use, but I bounced around when I got to New York. You know, you get an acting gig and you travel from here to there, and I was in one national tour, so we're definitely moving all the time. So I seem to have replicated that in my adult life, what I did in my childhood, living in a suitcase. So I've gotten used to traveling, and weirdly enough, the last 10 some odd years here in the city have been the longest time I've stayed in one place, more or less, with gigs here and there. But I've been basically in the city, and I'm getting a little bit of a little antsy. I suppose one of the great things about not having a traditional 9 to 5 is that when you get a job that might take you someplace, you got to go there, and you get to see and experience different parts of the country, and sometimes outside the country even. And that's certainly been a plus. I mean, every day I wake up and I think about the pros and cons of staying in it or not. And in fact, I spent the weekend with one of my best friends from my days of doing Les Miserables. And he and I have this discussion, and he's interviewing actors for a film project that he's been working on. And so he confronts this question that you're asking. Well, you haven't actually asked me this question, but it's something I think anybody in New York who is at, let's say, my career level, which is basically rank and file. I'm not famous by any means. So maybe some people who have worked with me know who I am, but within a small part of the theater community, I think people will know who I am. But that's most of everybody, and that's what my pal Chip was saying. We are part of a community, but the outside world, let's say, the people who just go to see a show, they're going to see star names, and they're part of the community, obviously. But what you don't hear about this vast underbelly of journeyman actors and stagehands. And one of my best friends is a lady named Carmel from my Les Mis. She's one of the top wig designers on Broadway.
Wow.
And we just went to go see The Last Ship, Sting's most recent show, last week, and we went to go see that. And there's so many great people I've met working in the theater that are not necessarily actors. And of course, I've met some great actors, but I have met so many wonderful behind the scenes people, and and directors and producers, and one of my best pals from that time that you actually came out to see me in La Jolla was the director of finance. Who knew that we would hit it off for La Jolla Playhouse? So you just never know. It's a kind of a wonderful, wacky adventure. And
this is exactly what I was hoping to cover, John, is that community you're living in, that lifestyle you have. And and I'm not saying it's a lifestyle that everybody will be comfortable with, or even something that you are 100% always comfortable with. But I think it's so fascinating to talk to different people and see where their lives will take them. Oftentimes is related to your career. But before we go off talking about the community and all the wonderful people that you met, and I feel like in your intro, you haven't given yourself enough credits for the things you've done, particularly the shows you've been in. Again, I feel like you started your career way before we met, about 10, 12 years ago. And if I may just throw a few names that I'm aware of and the shows I've been to, I think, King and I, Les Mis, Miss Saigon, and more recently, Batman, and
Batboy.
Batboy, and Yoshimi, and Living Room, I remember from New York, Broadway, off Broadway. And so I was wondering if you could speak to those gigs a little bit, maybe fill in a few more major shows I've missed out just now.
Well, I think you're just about it. You've covered my career.
Yes.
Of name things, yeah. So we can obviously. I moved to New York, thinking that I would just be a classical actor. That was my kind of dream, is to do Shakespeare.
Oh, really? What year was that?
1989. And I spent the first few years doing just Shakespeare in a lot of church basements. So I was cutting my teeth at that, learning a lot. But I realized one day, looking through the New York Times and looking at the show listings, that 8 out of 10 shows have music in them. And that my chances of working and making a living on the stage in New York would be increased gigantically if I really learned how to sing well enough to be on Broadway. So I really started applying myself with singing lessons. And out of all the shows that I remember thinking about and wanting to be in, it was really at the heyday of Les Mis, when Les Mis had entered in, I guess it opened in 86 or 87. Gosh, I remember, I just got out of college, and Colm Wilkinson, the original star, played Jean Valjean, was on The Tonight Show and sang Bring Him Home for Johnny Carson. And I'd never heard a man sing like that. So that's when I got really interested in the show. And so that was definitely a target for me. And in terms of where we all have kind of bucket list things to do, many of us, as whatever profession, some of them we get, some of them we don't. I was really fortunate to get the show that I thought became a dream come true.
Wow.
And that was Les Mis, and I was in it in I guess it had been open for about 10 years, so it was still the hottest show. Every actor, everyone wanted to be in that show.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everyone still does. But I think for those of us who had done the original production of it, the version that was originally 3 hours and 20 minutes, if I remember, and then they cut it back to just under 3 hours. A couple of years after I was in it, they shortened it, so obviously it's a long show, but I did the original long version of it, and it was an exhausting thing to get through. But we, I think for those of us, I think that the show has this thing of bequeathing upon anyone who's gone through it for a while a special kind of fellowship and a camaraderie. Even if I've never worked with that actor in the show, I certainly would have heard of their name, and we have this, oh, do you know so-and-so? Oh, yeah, I remember we just missed each other. And that's what that show, especially with the longevity, it's still going now. It just got reinstated on Broadway. And there's just a whole new generation now that is going through what my pals and I did, let's say almost 15 years ago now, thereabouts. And it's a great gift. It was a great gift to be in that show, to do it, and to work with everybody. And eventually, I got a chance to do it with the guys on The Tonight Show, with Colm Wilkinson. He came back to the show.
Wow.
And I will never forget the day he showed up on stage. He came to a put-in rehearsal.
Yeah.
And I just remembered that everyone just kind of made this circle, kind of backed away. He came off the wings, and our associate director said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Colm Wilkinson." The whole cast started applauding wildly. And he hadn't done the show in a few years, and he went through it with us. And it was such a magical time to do it with him, because you just felt that you were performing with a living legend.
I can definitely imagine.
Yeah, and everyone who's seen Les Mis and everything, he's certainly one of the Valjeans that everybody compares all the other Valjeans. They've such great performers I've worked with who've done that role, but there's something about that actor, that man at that time got that role, and everything, there was just such a perfect confluence of everything being ready for his voice and his comportment and his he was the perfect man, perfect place, perfect time. And just to be brushing up against that was just fantastic. And I got to do it with him in a city that I would love to go back and visit. I was in Toronto.
Wow.
So I mean, the
far away
women's
from home.
gifted me in so many ways and taking me around North America, and that was a wonderful time. Yeah, certainly a highlight of my acting career to be able to do that with him.
And I will highlight that information, John, in the show notes as well. And figure I bring that up. You know, names and moments and any tools and resources that you bring up throughout this conversation. I will actually have a webpage, as you can see, to highlight that, so the audience can really read more about these people. And you know, this is fascinating to me, that I believe his last name is Wilkinson. He had a huge impact in your life, but sometimes for someone like me, you know, who isn't as integrated in the community, you know, we all struggle to only recognize their face, and then their faces, and often they're forgotten after the show. Not for you, but you know, this is a moment where I feel like I want to celebrate really extraordinary people in every field. So, so on that note, John, I was wondering if we could, you know, talk about typically, you know, not just what your day, you know, clearly the questions what your day is like, often asked to full-time people like myself with a 9-to-6 job. Every day is more or less the same, but it's very different for you. So I'm very curious to ask you what the audition process is like, or perhaps what is it like to work with an agent, and how to really land a gig. You know, you can use King and I or Les Mis or any example that you find helpful.
Well, landing gigs, it's there. I can't even say it's formulaic. There is let's say the traditional. You have an agent who calls you with an audition, and you go in and you get it. And there's also word of mouth. People know you, and people call you and offer it to you. Which is ideally what everybody wants to get to, that you become so well known and so trusted to be able to do a part that you get there. I think most actors are not, well, at least in my circle, I don't know a lot of friends who just get called up and offered. Almost all of us have to audition, even if it's a courtesy audition. But the examples, let's say as of like the next show that I'm doing, I didn't even know, which, you know, dovetails into, I think you wanted me to say some favorite lines I've ever said. But I had to sing a line in a show out at the Yoshimi show, and the line is suddenly everything has changed. And that's really so profound for the human race, certainly, because we that's how it goes, right? It seems such a simple idea, and yet that is something that is part of it is so saturated into my life that today, not really sure how it would pan out from the moment I woke up. Tomorrow, I don't have any idea of what's in store for me. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because my next show that I'm going to be working on, I went in and auditioned, and I didn't get a call back. So that's usually in the way it's like a second interview. That means they've whittled it down. Now, the first time I went in and auditioned for this show last week, usually you can tell if it's going well, if they're digging you, and everything seemed to be great, kumbaya and everything, but I didn't hear from them later on that day, and I said, well, gosh, you just never know. I guess I didn't get it. And I know they had callback days. I didn't hear from them. And then last night, I get the phone call from producer. We'd love for you to play the part.
Wow! Congratulations, John. I'm so happy for you.
So there you go. And suddenly, everything has changed. This morning, I spoke to him, and suddenly everything has changed. Tomorrow, I have to go into rehearsal at 1:00. I've got music coming to me. All of a sudden, I've got to learn this part and learn this music.
Today.
We have 1 week. We have 1 week to put the show up for an invited audience for the industry, meaning that they're trying to find seed money and develop the show a little bit more. Now, what was so exciting to me is that, it's an adaptation of Treasure Island. And so a pirate swashbuckling thing, and the music is being written by kind of a childhood hero. His name's Graham Russell, and most people probably have never heard of him, but for those who are old enough, he is the part of the rock group Air Supply.
No way.
Yeah, way.
Yeah, I know Air Supply.
Air Supply.
Wow. This is amazing, John.
Music, and so I'm going in we're going to start tomorrow, and I can't wait to see who else they cast. And
this is fabulous.
That's going to be my week. I know, as a general sense, that's going to be my week. And next week, I have no idea what will happen in my life when this is over.
And you have naturally transitioned into one area of sort of a topic I really want to talk about. That was also part of the audition process. But, personally, I've always been very fascinated by, in particular, Broadway actors and actresses, because the way I look at TV shows, you have most of the lines are relatively short, and the scenes change up very quickly. Whereas Broadways are hundreds of people, at a stadium of some sort of theater. And I remember going to your shows. You have to remember these insane amount of lines and in context and acting and singing. So I kind of want to talk about that for a second. Now you have a script in hand, and you're preparing for tomorrow, and that sounds completely insane. So I wonder what the short-term process and preparation is like. But furthermore, a lot of the other shows I've been in, King and I, those shows go on for hours, and I wondered, how do you prepare for those shows as well? How do you memorize?
Let me say, I will say something that it kind of depends. Interestingly enough, I think the easiest, it's not ever easy, but what is actually fairly easy to memorize is Shakespeare.
Oh, man. I would never imagine that. That's counterintuitive.
Isn't that kind of crazy?
It's nuts.
And if it's only because he was a magician, a genius. And the way his writing works, first of all, there's if you're writing in the iambic pentameter, you just instinctively know there's so many beats per line. Oftentimes there'll be rhyming couplets, and there are all these cues as to how to lead yourself into how to play the part, because Shakespeare kind of almost wrote the direction into the lines. And weirdly enough, I have found memorizing long speeches, I'm able to do that faster with Shakespeare than with any playwright I've ever worked on. I've never worked on let's say a Mammoth play where he's famous for writing in ums and ahs and pauses and this very specific rhythm to his thing. And he's replicating almost everyday human speech. And that seems to be really hard to do. It's almost a case-by-case basis, but as I find myself, if I have trouble, I'll often assume the role of the playwright and actually get a yellow pad out and write the lines out. I'll write out, if I'm in the scene, I'll write the other characters' lines out and then write my lines out, maybe in bigger letters or highlight them. I'll do anything to sort of tricking my brain into just getting it into my bones, literally getting it into my fingers, so that there are different neural pathways to learning the lines. Oftentimes I'll record the lines by rote without any inflection, and I'll record them. And when I go jogging on my iPod, I will listen to them. So I'm constantly, unfortunately, pounded by the sound of my own voice saying the lines over and over.
No, this is so fascinating, John. And I think you know, sometimes people like yourself kind of, I'd imagine, your writer, your actor, you take this process for granted. You know, this is a system you figure out for yourself. And I think that is phenomenal. You know, to pause for a second, when I teach Mandarin to little kids in my Taekwondo school, some of them are as young as 6 or 7 years old. I mean, they barely know how to write so many words just yet, and they certainly don't understand how to really, follow the Chinese symbols or pinyin, anything in that nature. But I notice the smartest little kids will figure out a system somehow for them to remember what I teach them. And the younger they are, somehow the quicker they learn. But I love how you describe, you know, I literally just jotted down yellow, I would say yellow pages, but yellow pads and iPod. Yeah. It just really getting ingrained into what you're doing. And one of the things growing up in China, the things we say, the characters, as you know, learning Asian characters can be very complicated. And one of the things the teachers will tell you is stop speaking and start writing them down. And yeah, exactly. Just that even for little kids, how you move your wrists, all different directions, trying to learn Chinese calligraphy, writing, and it really, they really get embedded in your brain somehow and create that, what you had described as a sort of a neural connection. So really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. As I get older and change and our brains just change, I find myself doing different things. The old days, I still do this. You put your hand over the paper, look at it, say it out loud, put it, and then take it off and try to memorize what the line was. I still do that. That's actually still one of the best ways to do it. I don't know why that works, but that oftentimes is still not enough. And the memorization thing, I think, I've noticed in the past, 20 some odd years that I've been at this, that people expect you to be able to be off book much faster than when I started out.
Oh, man.
So the demand for you as an actor to learn your lines very quickly, it has sped up. I think it's probably the internet and access to your sides. In the old days, you had to, if you got an audition, you had to go downtown, go to your agent's office, or go to the casting director, pick up the script. That's a whole thing. Now they just email it to you and they say, "This is what you have to know by tomorrow morning."
Wow.
And they just expect you that we all are all connected, that we can. You'll get your PDF and read it and memorize it. Though interestingly enough, by the union guidelines, they're not allowed to tell you to memorize it. Because then it would be a performance and then they would have to pay you. So if you're auditioning, you hold the script in your hand and you kind of pretend, and it's always nice to have it there in case you forget a line, but you always have the script in your hand when you audition, but you're expected to not really need that. piece of paper. You expected to know it. That's your kind of job as an auditioner.
Yeah,
And it really wasn't like that when I started out. People, I didn't really wasn't too worried about it. But it's just become more and more of the norm now.
Yeah. This is interesting because, John, you've been at this for 20 or so years, and I know that through Batboy, and I realized you traveled and lived with a lot of people in their 20s, and it's really fascinating. We'll get there in terms of the lifestyle and the travel involved. But, all the shows I've been to that you've been in, I secretly and quietly, I was always holding my fingers thinking like, oh my God, please make sure that John doesn't forget a line. And, you work so hard at this. And
you think you're doing that. What do you think I'm doing? I'm saying the same thing. Exactly what's going on through my head. Oh God.
I seriously, I always wish if I had a better spot at the show, if I could just hold up something neon-like and with a script on it, and I could help you out. And obviously you're a professional, and I know that a lot of the shows you perform, like Les Mis, King and I, you will be going at it for months and months. And I wonder, what, two-part question. One, what is it like to repeatedly act out, a show for weeks or months at a time, and sometimes, as you mentioned, multiple shows per day. Part two is, what if you forget the script? What's gonna happen, and what do you do instead to compensate that? Like, I always wanted to ask actors.
Oh boy. Well, let's see.
The truth
First
is
of all,
out.
I think every performer, if you do it long enough, you're going to do a show and you're going to forget a line, or something's going to happen. It just happens. It was happens to everybody. And happens. I think it has happened to everybody. And for myself, fortunately, as a knock on wood, not in recent memory, but it's come close where I thought, oh, I almost missed a cue getting on stage for the last show I did. And you run it 1,000 times over in your head by yourself during rehearsal, and one little thing needs to slip, and the whole thing will come. You'll forget, and it still happens to people who've been doing it for a long time. Part of that is actually the excitement of being on edge of that. You've got to be on your toes, and that's part of the adrenaline. And one of the reasons why I think I was able to do Les Mis I did it for 5 years.
Oh, jeez.
That I became a swing, which meant that I was in my regular track, but then I asked, I want to learn all the other parts in the show. So, and it kept my brain very elastic and let me experience the show through every actor's point of view with their character and their costume changes and what they had to do. And it gave me a much more profound sense of and appreciation for what everyone else was doing. But it also, I basically not even quadrupled, more than that, my need to memorize everybody's parts and singing parts and lines and blocking and what piece of costume they had to go on and what side of the stage they needed to come on. I was in a constant fear of doing that. And sure, I think I might not have done it as perfectly as the people who do it all the time, but that was really part of the juice of having fun and feeling challenged.
That's great.
At doing it. You mentioned King and I. That was certainly one of the biggest parts I've ever done. And that show, most of the Kings, he only has 2 songs. He's got one long patter song and a short little song. But his show is mostly these long book scenes. And that did take a while to memorize, because I had, especially an iconic show and a part like that, you felt so much, and it was such an honor to be able to do it once, and you felt like, oh my God, you're in the shadow of Yul Brynner and all these people who played the part, and it's one of the great parts in American musical theater. And I felt very much some sort of sense of pride of being able to make sure I landed every line perfectly and did that. It was kind of, I wanted to be part of that.
And John,
it took me impromptu for you now.
talking about in Les Mis, you play different parts, and that's unbelievable. And King and I think it's a phenomenal performance by you. And then your friends or people who are among the audience were in tears. You've obviously come a long way. That you've always been great, but that sort of your signature that we keep reflecting back upon. And so I was wondering, there's no such thing as a typical show, but what is quote unquote a typical show, like even like Yoshimi or Batboy? How long do you have to perform? Give us a sense for, is it every day, and then how many days a week? And on top of all that, how do you keep motivating yourself? Is there a magic moment, the curtain opens and you're just ready, you're ready there for your audience, for your world, or sometimes you feel, honestly, less excitement and you kind of have to pump yourself up a little bit?
Yeah, well, just like we all do, there are certain shows that I'm more stoked to do than others.
Yeah,
or
of course.
I find after time, I was really stoked to begin with, not so much at the end, and vice versa. And I mean, some of the typical things are just because of how things are structured, depending upon the contract. But let's say if you did, for most people who would go to theater, if they ever go to theater, if they want to go, they would probably try to go to a Broadway show. But Broadway show will typically rehearse for, let's say, maybe 2 months and maybe 4 to 6 weeks of previews before an opening night, before the press comes. And in that sense, they have as much practice time as you can get, because the producers are paying for it and they're building a show from the ground up, which is certainly not easy to do. Depending upon the contract, you can have let's say that's the longest. Usually it's much shorter than that. And usually you're not building a show from the ground up. Almost everything I've ever done has been a show that's been done at least once previously. And when I joined Les Mis, it had been open for about 10 years. So it was a well-oiled machine with adjustments here and there. For those who've never been, Broadway is 8 shows a week, and so you're going to theater every day, except one day off usually, or a day and a half, depending upon the schedule. And if you are an understudy, you go into understudy once a week during the afternoon, or if you have something called a put-in rehearsal, if they put a new person into the show, they will call the cast to come in and run the show during the day. The feeling really is when you're working on Broadway, you are at the theater all the time. Unless you are one of the lead roles, you are there all the time. And certainly in my case, when I was swinging the show, every single understudy rehearsal, put-in rehearsal, some special thing, I just was there. But they pay the swings a little bit more for their time and for knowing everything about the show. So I opted to do that. And you know what? If I'm in the show, I want to be in it. I don't have better things to do other than doing it. Now, when I worked out regionally around the country, the contracts are different, so you don't spend as much time. Sometimes you don't have understudy rehearsal, or it's not planned as much. The shows run shorter lengths, let's say typically 6 weeks to 2 months, maybe a little bit more, maybe sometimes more if the show's a hit, sometimes less. Usually less because they're doing seasons where they're filling in shows, like 5 shows during the spring, summer season or something. So there's usually an end date to your contract, so you see the end coming. Those shows will rehearse something like 10 to 6, 10 to 4. You probably won't be called for that entire time, but they will put a show up in about 2 weeks. And it's a lot of pre-planning so that when you're actually in the room, everyone is off like a rocket, and we're figuring out how you're going to do blocking, integrate the sets and costumes, and voila, you have a show. And it does feel like getting shot out of a cannon at the beginning. And then you get into a groove, and then you're enjoying yourself. I mean, ultimately, look, the word is play, right? So we're in a play, and it feels like you're playing. It feels like you're getting paid to have a good time. And I think most actors will agree that is part of the appeal, and it certainly is. I don't feel like what I do is as hard as trying to get a landing craft on Mars, or try to reconcile two different points of view in Congress, which seems, I mean, when I hear people try to do that, it just seems, how do you do that?
Mm-hmm.
So I think what I do is relatively easy, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard in its own ways to do it very well, but I guess we all have each our own feelings about what we do in our life.
Mm-hmm.
There are certainly some shows that are much harder to learn and do than others. And it's case-by-case basis. I don't, for instance, I don't know what I have in store for me this coming week.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I know I have, I think, one of the lead roles in the show, but I don't know how big they've written the part. I don't know if there's going to be a lot to do.
So that's a kind of a surprise, right? So back to your Match.com metaphor, it's like you don't even know, just by looking at a very vague pixelated picture, you don't know who exactly is going to show up and what the expectation will be. But I think that's very interesting to talk about. Is one of the questions sent to you, John, is about being at your experience, and I feel like you've really stumbled upon a lot of different scenarios, shows. You've traveled around the country and actually outside of the country as well. In Europe, you speak fluent French, and so I was yeah, I was wondering, what is your advice for people who are starting out? And I don't know if there's such a thing as starting out in acting. And what's your advice to kids fresh out of college, or people who are perhaps in their mid to late 20s or even 30s who are thinking about this as a career? What's your take on that? Challenges, rejections, randomness, and all the excitement, of course.
Gigantic, profound question.
Should I?
Anytime you log on to any actor advice column on the internet, this question is asked and answered
so many times.
Every minute. So we're going to try our best with the podcast here.
Yeah, your personal take on it. Yeah.
One of the ways you give advice to someone is don't do what I do. So I've got a thin skin. I will admit that. So having as much of a brush it off attitude as you can will carry you through some very long, dark times. Mm-hmm. And I can say that I've let disappointments and saturate a little bit too long than they should into my psyche, and that's been one of the more difficult parts of pursuing acting, because your opportunities to actually act are so infinitesimal. The fact that I actually even got a chance to audition for this show that I'm doing was. They even made a point of saying that to me when they offered me a chance to even come in and try out for the part. They said, "We've gotten thousands of submissions. We've given you a slot to come in." Wow. So, it's almost like a lottery. Yeah. And I keep forgetting how many I just went to see a show last night of actors who worked their asses off to do the show. I don't think a lot of the shows they weren't to my taste, let's put it that way. But I know they worked so hard on doing it. So there are just so many people out there, and I just think we all have to you got to basically love yourself doing it. And if you don't anymore, then it's time to take a break.
Yeah, and then John, I think, again, it's really true. I think that is such great advice, and in particular for acting and anything along the line of the entertainment business. But I have to admit that is really good advice for people everywhere. People going on interviews, people really dislike their current jobs and finally have the courage to go on different interviews, feeling rejected, and most of the time, most employers don't really respond with anything, and you're left just feeling kind of hopeless, or don't know what to expect. And luckily for me that I haven't had to experience too much of that in my career, but here I am, honestly, putting myself out there on a podcast. And to be honest, I've been so hard on myself, and I wish I remember to call you to kind of balance that off. Even hearing my voice on the audio, which I have to, as you know, for post-production, I was really suffering, and I was really struggling, and it took me quite a while. And to be honest, episode 1, which was officially released just a week ago, I actually had that episode ready, produced 2 weeks before. But I never thought that would happen to me. I never thought how quote little of myself I thought, and I was really struggling big time. And the crazy part to your part is like sometimes that when that emotion takes over, you kind of go into this downward spiral, even though it sounds so silly, right? It's a podcast. I'm the manager, director. I got really nothing to lose, but to throw myself out there, and people ask me how I feel, and I feel very vulnerable. I feel naked, So anyway, back to you. I don't mean to dump it on you, but I feel like when you're in it, like you don't sense that that's how people feel. That you, like, for instance, the podcast story probably made you feel that's ridiculous, Faye. How would you ever think that? And I did, and I can imagine at times it could be very dark and very difficult for people in acting,
Well, yeah, whenever you are basically living what many people in the performing arts go through all the time. And in some ways, I guess putting a podcast is like stepping out on stage or...
Yeah, for me.
Well, it is. This is kind of a way of putting yourself... I felt the same way when I tried to make a website. I'm like, oh God, now people are going to know a little bit more about me and see me when they want to. And I have no control over... I have some control over the content, but at the same time, is this really the best I can do? Mm-hmm. And I suppose we always have to constantly remind ourselves that everybody's like a frail, wonderful human being in their own way and is trying their best. Everyone's trying their best. Mm-hmm. And
relying the tools that they have access to, right? Yeah. And I think my second episode guest, Josh Green, really speaks to that, is oftentimes we want to live in an ideal world. We want every situation to be most ideal. But at the same time, we've all been just given the tools that, we have. And then to your point, there's, out of 1,000 people, you've been chosen for the show tomorrow. And I just want to say that how many things in this world has an acceptance rate of 0.1%? I don't mean to nerd out on math here, but think about for you to have attended Brown University, and I believe when you enter school around that year's 5 to 6% acceptance rate. But think about it in acting. Significantly reduces anybody's chances in getting anything. Really.
Yeah, truthfully. It is. Every time I get something, I just think how many... There are literally hundreds of people, hundreds of guys who similar type or whatever, who could easily fill... We're all replaceable, all of us. Mm-hmm. And but at this moment, it's going to be me, or it's going to be someone else, but it's going to be yours for the time, and to accept it and to graciously embrace it and do the best you can with what you got. So that's what I keep reminding myself, trying to remind myself all the time, because every gig feels like it might be the last one. This might be it.
Yeah.
It goes. You can laugh after it. If you can't laugh at the moment, you can laugh about it afterward. That's good therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that we talked about keeping you on for an hour, and I had no idea that you actually need to spend some serious time preparing for your show tomorrow. So I was wondering, it's still in the audition stage, so I suspect that it's inconvenient to reveal more details, right?
Yeah, I don't really know much about it other than that it's I don't know much about it's an adaptation of Treasure Island. That's about all I know so far. I have not seen the full script, and I know that Graham Russell, I told you, from Air Supply, is attached to it, and that's about it up to now. So, and I just have my rehearsal times blocked out. So I'll find out more tomorrow. Maybe we should do this podcast tomorrow.
Yeah, we can certainly, we can do a little bit add-on.
There's a little part, one of my favorite parts of, one of my favorite parts in Les Mis, if only because of the sentiment involved in the show. There was right before Valjean sings "Bring Him Home." All the students are gathering around and getting ready to go to bed, and they're all kind of sharing a drink together and contemplating their life. And it was a song. Whenever someone had to leave the show, their last performance, everyone made sure they went over with their cup and toasted that person on stage. It was a great tradition, I thought, of acknowledgement, of friendship, and so the song starts off, drink with me, today's gone by, sing with me the songs we knew. Here's to pretty girls who went to our heads. Here's to witty girls who went to our beds. Here's to them, and here's to you.
So thank you so much for sharing the moment with me, and I know, and with us, it's very interesting, and things I'm still learning along the way. In particular, podcasting. I feel like if I go to work one day, if somebody is listening to my podcast in a conference room, I will immediately storm out of that. I would be so embarrassed, But to invite you to share your stories, obviously the super exciting ones, and but also the challenges. I know it's really difficult to talk about them, but I think that people will want to listen to that, to feel like we're not alone, if you know what I mean. It's I think when we share stories and people find it resonating, is they could relate to. And very recently, there was a person in financial services, extremely successful, dared to write a book called How I Lost $1 Million, or $10 million, I think it was $1 million. And it was a top seller, as you can imagine. And people, really resonate with a lot of people in finance or elsewhere. So I think you really shared a very balanced, really interesting story of being an actor and the struggles you've had. But I think, in my podcast blog, I'm going to include a lot of these big names, the shows that you've been in. I think it's incredible. And just so you know, as a friend, as many friends of yours, we just cannot be more proud,
My God, you're making me cry. Stop it.
Oh, stop it. But I need to prepare for my show. And it's so important, John. And it's not just encouragement. And I know everybody needs that. But truthfully, the reason for many of us to want to drive 6, 7, 8 hours to see you is to be there with you and to kind of share that very special moment. And it's absolutely incredible. You just create that moment, and you not only you create that moment, you created a experience for the rest of us, if you know what I mean. I think it's very different. I've been to many Broadway shows beyond the ones I've gone to for you, for us, and but it's really not the same. It's not nearly the same. And the fact, if I just invoke that real quick, is knowing you after or before the show, we get to meet all the actors and actresses, sit down for a drink with them, and you take us to the backstage. Yoshimi was particularly interesting with the setup and the sort of the technical considerations involved. It was really...
you and Wayne Coyne are big friends now.
I might have to post that picture. That picture was
better.
Taken. Yeah, the best part is I actually came back from your show the week after, and I was having dim sum with a bunch of my coworkers, and there was a coworker of mine who started talking about Wayne Coyne out of nowhere. I was like, "Oh, here's on my iPhone." I pull up a picture. He's like, what is going on here? He was so confused, and it was like no alcohol influence, and he was, it was amazing.
That's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, but thank you for creating these moments, and it keeps coming up on Facebook, many of the social media channels, and they do a look back photos of the things that you've been in, photos of, and I just see these moments with you, and I would not otherwise have, I don't think other than you, I've never had this opportunity to experience firsthand, and I hope that continues, and I really hope this podcast does something very positive for you as well.
I definitely feel energized. Yeah, you make me realize that it's been maybe it is worthwhile.
Yeah, and it's absolutely, and I get a little nerdy when it comes to this, but the people you've mentioned and the fact that you've had a relationship, with these amazing directors, actors, actresses, you've learned from all of them. I don't think that can be overlooked, So I really want to transform this conversation and your ability in learning and telling a story to really influence people beyond just the immediate circle of yours. So, yeah. So thank you so much for your time. I'm really excited, as you can tell. And
thanks, Faye. Oh my God, I miss you so much.
Well, I miss you too, John. And
I think I should end with a song from Air Supply and have my 80s pop rock.
Yes.
Thing, right?
Yes.
I don't know if he's going to be at this rehearsal tomorrow, but one of my favorite songs. If he asks, I would just go, I'm lying alone with my head on the phone, thinking of you till it hurts. I know you hurt too, but what else can we do to melt it and torn apart? I think I'll stop there. If only because, as a friend of mine has said to me, I remember singing this one time. He said, John, please don't ever sing that for an audition, because no grown man sits there and thinks of a woman with his head on the phone, crying his eyes out. He may have done it when he was 12, but after that, no.
You'll not be taken seriously ever again. But you know what? I think those cheesy moments, I realize, whether in acting or not in real life, things you've been told to never do are the ones who really set you apart. To listen to more episodes of the Feisworld podcast, please subscribe on iTunes or visit feisworld.com. That is FEISWORLD, where you can find show notes, links, other tools, and resources. You can also follow me on Twitter at Feisworld. Until next time, thanks for listening.